Picture this scene from the summer of 1944, somewhere in the northern reaches of Saipan, where an 18-year-old Marine barely tipping the scales at 123 pounds was about to pull off something that would defy everything anyone thought possible in the Pacific theatre. Guy Louis Gabaldon, a private first class of Mexican-American heritage, stood outside a network of caves where hundreds upon hundreds of Japanese soldiers and civilians had holed up, convinced that capture by American forces meant nothing but torture followed by death. What this young man accomplished that day would go down as perhaps the most remarkable one-man rescue mission anyone had witnessed in that entire brutal war. By the time the sun set on July 8th, this lone Marine would talk more than 800 Japanese soldiers and civilians into surrendering, and before the war wrapped up entirely, he'd be credited with bringing in roughly 1,500 enemy personnel who'd been fed nothing but propaganda about how Americans were monsters waiting to devour them alive. The real story here wasn't about superior firepower or brilliant tactical maneuvers. It was about the gap between what people had been told and what one young man could show them through his grasp of their language and understanding of their culture. The path that brought Gabaldon to that moment on Saipan started 5,400 miles away in the Boyle Heights section of East Los Angeles. He came into the world on March 22, 1926, one kid among 7 in a Mexican-American household that was scraping by through the Depression years like so many others. Everything shifted for him when he hit 12 years old and ended up moving in with the Nakano family, Japanese Americans who'd opened their home to this young boy. For several years running, Gabaldon lived his life with the Nakanos, soaking up the Japanese language and all the cultural nuances that came with it. Nobody ever made it official with adoption papers or anything like that, but he became family all the same, sitting down to Japanese meals, speaking Japanese around the house, picking up not just how to string words together, but grasping the deeper stuff about honor and family ties and all those subtle social cues that governed how Japanese people interacted with one another. Then December 7th rolled around in 1941, and everything fell apart. Inside 4 months, Executive Order 9066 came down and forced the Nakanos along with 120,000 other Japanese Americans into those internment camps. The family that had taken Gabaldon in got shipped off to Heart Mountain, Wyoming, where they became part of the 14,000 Japanese Americans penned up there from 1942 through 1945. Gabaldon watched the people who'd cared for him get ripped away from their home and everything they knew. When he turned 17, he signed up with the Marines, driven by a mix of patriotic feeling and this sense that maybe his unusual language abilities could serve some purpose in the war effort. His Japanese wasn't textbook perfect or anything, but he could hold a conversation, having learned it the natural way at a dinner table instead of from some classroom instructor drilling verb conjugations. By March of 1944, Private Gabaldon found himself assigned to Headquarters and Service Company with the 2nd Marines, 2nd Marine Division, working as a scout and observer where his language skills might actually come in handy. His unit was gearing up for Operation Forager, the massive push to take the Mariana Islands, where intelligence reports said 30,000 Japanese troops were dug in on Saipan, along with who knew how many thousands of Japanese civilians. The picture military intelligence painted looked pretty grim going in. The Japanese military had handed out grenades to families living on the island, taught kids how to attack American soldiers, and filled every mother's head with stories about how the Marines were all criminals pulled straight from prisons who'd torture anyone they got their hands on. The propaganda machine had worked overtime, depicting Americans as literal demons who'd rape women and cannibalize children. The whole setup pointed toward massive civilian casualties once the fighting started. Gabaldon came ashore with the invasion force on June 15, 1944, wading through the surf onto Saipan's beaches. The battle would drag on until July 9th, with American forces slowly grinding forward and pushing Japanese military units and civilians northward across the island. What set Gabaldon apart from every other Marine hitting that beach wasn't his shooting skills or combat training. It was these unauthorized nighttime missions he started running. According to what ended up in his Navy Cross citation and the Marine Corps records, Gabaldon began slipping away from his unit after dark, against all orders, going out alone to approach Japanese positions by himself. His whole approach was backwards from standard operating procedure, but it worked. He'd creep up to caves and bunkers where Japanese soldiers and civilians were hiding, then call out in Japanese that he was by himself and unarmed, telling them they'd be treated decently if they came out and surrendered. His first success happened early in the campaign. He approached a cave one night, sat himself down outside in the darkness, and started talking in conversational Japanese about food and safety, and how prisoners were actually being treated. After hours of patient talking, several Japanese soldiers finally emerged and gave themselves up. Word spread through his unit about what he'd managed to pull off, though his commanding officers initially thought his methods were pretty questionable. Marine Corps records show how Gabaldon's whole style differed completely from the standard military interpreters who'd stand there with bullhorns demanding surrender in stiff, formal military Japanese. Gabaldon spoke the way regular people talked, respectfully, using the same language patterns and cultural knowledge he'd absorbed from the Nakanos all those years. The big moment, the one that would define Gabaldon's entire war experience, came on July 8, 1944. By that date, American forces had squeezed the remaining Japanese forces and civilians into the northern tip of Saipan. The situation had turned desperate. Mass civilian suicides had already started at places that would forever be known as Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff, where hundreds of Japanese civilians, absolutely convinced that being captured meant torture, hurled themselves and their children into the ocean below. According to the National Museum of the Marine Corps and what's written in Gabaldon's Navy Cross citation, on July 8th, he approached this large concentration of Japanese holed up in caves and bunkers. Nobody documented the exact location or recorded the specific conversations that took place, but the result is verified beyond question. Gabaldon walked back to American lines with 807 prisoners, a mix of soldiers and civilians walking behind him. This single day's achievement represents one of the biggest surrenders to an individual soldier in the entire history of the United States military. Marine Corps intelligence officers, including Colonel Walter Lehrer, Colonel John Schwaber, and Major James High, would later verify these numbers on television in 1957 during an episode of This Is Your Life. The sheer extraordinary nature of what Gabaldon had accomplished led to both recognition and skepticism in equal measure. Captain John Schwaber put him up for the Medal of Honor on July 15, 1944, just days after that mass surrender. However, General Holland Smith, who commanded the expeditionary troops, downgraded that recommendation. The citation that eventually accompanied his Navy Cross reads that working alone in the front lines, Private First Class Gabaldon daringly entered enemy caves, pillboxes, buildings and jungle brush, frequently facing hostile fire, and succeeded not only in obtaining vital military information, but in capturing well over 1,000 enemy civilians and troops. That said, Lieutenant Robert B. Sheeks, a Marine Japanese language officer who served on Saipan, later expressed some real skepticism about certain claims Gabaldon made, characterizing him as a relentless self-promoter. This criticism highlights just how difficult it is to verify the exact details of what Gabaldon did out there, since he was often working alone at night without any witnesses around. His successes have to be understood within the absolutely brutal context of the Saipan battle itself. The island witnessed some of the worst fighting the Pacific War ever saw, with over 3,000 American deaths and virtually the entire Japanese garrison of 30,000 killed. Most tragic of all, an estimated 22,000 Japanese civilians died during the battle, many of them by their own hands. The mass civilian suicides at Saipan shocked American forces to their core. Mothers threw their children off cliff faces before jumping after them. Entire families pulled grenade pins together. Japanese military propaganda had drilled into civilians' heads that American capture would result in torture, rape, and actual cannibalism. Against this horrific backdrop, Gabaldon's ability to convince any Japanese to surrender was remarkable in itself. His success demonstrates that cultural knowledge and the ability to speak someone's language could overcome even the most intense propaganda campaigns. Every single person he convinced to surrender was one fewer casualty in a battle that was already claiming terrible numbers of civilian lives at an absolutely staggering rate. Late in the Saipan campaign, Gabaldon took machine gun fire while conducting one of his solo missions and got wounded. His Navy Cross citation mentions these wounds, but doesn't nail down the exact date or specific location where it happened. Despite getting hit, he kept running his operations until they finally evacuated him for medical treatment. After recovering from his wounds, Gabaldon returned to duty and took part in additional Pacific operations, though nothing would ever match the scale of what he'd achieved on Saipan. His total captures for the war are officially listed as well over 1,000 enemy civilians and troops, with most sources putting the figure at 1,000, approximately 1,500 total captures across his service. Gabaldon initially received the Silver Star for his actions on Saipan. This got upgraded to the Navy Cross on November 23, 1960, making it the highest decoration awarded to a Marine of Mexican descent during the entire Second World War. The Navy Cross ranks as the Navy and Marine Corps' second highest decoration for valor, sitting just below the Medal of Honor. Multiple campaigns have tried to get Gabaldon's Navy Cross upgraded to the Medal of Honor over the years. Los Angeles Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa, the Hispanic Medal of Honor Society, and various congressional representatives have all led efforts to make this happen. Every single one has been rejected, officially because of time limitations on reconsidering awards, though some people suggest there's a reluctance to recognize unconventional warfare methods that fall outside standard military doctrine. The controversy extends way beyond just medals and decorations. Some historians question whether one man could actually have achieved such numbers on his own. Others point out that Gabaldon's methods, operating alone at night without witnesses, make independent verification extremely difficult, if not impossible. Yet Marine Corps intelligence officers did verify his achievements on the record, and his Navy Cross citation represents official military recognition of what he accomplished. In 1960, Hollywood released Hell to Eternity, supposedly based on Gabaldon's story. The film starred Jeffrey Hunter, this 6-foot-tall, blue-eyed actor playing Gabaldon, which effectively erased his Mexican-American identity from the story entirely. The movie transformed his patient negotiations into action hero theatrics, turned his cultural understanding into standard American swagger and bravado. Gabaldon himself was reportedly pretty disappointed with how the film turned out, given that it took considerable liberties with his actual story. The Hollywood version emphasized combat sequences over communication, violence over patience, turning what was really a story about building cultural bridges into just another conventional war movie that could have been about anyone. The film's distortions would shape how the public perceived Gabaldon's achievements for decades afterward. In 1990, Gabaldon published his autobiography titled Saipan, Suicide Island, which later got republished as America Betrayed. The book provides his personal account of his wartime experiences, though historians note that memoirs written decades after events have to be evaluated carefully for accuracy. In his book, Gabaldon emphasized that his success came from treating Japanese soldiers and civilians as human beings rather than just enemies, from understanding their culture rather than merely their language, from exercising patience rather than applying force. He described sitting for hours outside caves in the darkness, talking about food and family and safety, until fear gradually gave way to trust. After the war wrapped up, Gabaldon returned to civilian life and eventually settled on Saipan for 20 years, where he started up a fishing business. He got married and had 11 children, 9 of whom survived to adulthood. He spent decades traveling around speaking at schools and various events about his experiences, always emphasizing the importance of understanding other cultures. On July 7, 2006, Los Angeles Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa honored Gabaldon at City Hall, recognizing his contributions to American military history. Just weeks after that, on August 31st, 2006, Gabaldon died of heart disease in Old Town, Florida, at age 80. They buried him with full military honours at Arlington National Cemetery. Lane Nakano, one of Gabaldon's adoptive brothers from the family that taught him Japanese in the first place, served with the legendary 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which was composed almost entirely of Japanese-American soldiers. The 442nd became the most decorated unit in United States military history for its size and length of service, earning 9,486 Purple Hearts and 21 Medals of Honor. The parallel service of Gabaldon and Lane Nakano tells a unique story within the broader American military history. One man using Japanese language skills to save Japanese lives, while the other proved Japanese-American loyalty through combat in Europe, all while their Japanese-American family sat confined in an internment camp. Both men served with real distinction while their family remained locked up behind barbed wire. Lane Nakano survived the war and lived until April 28, 2005, maintaining contact with Gabaldon throughout their lives. Their shared story illustrates just how complicated World War II really was, where racial prejudice at home existed side by side with heroism abroad. While pinpointing specific influence on military doctrine is difficult to document precisely, one military source notes that Gabaldon's efforts have become standard teaching examples for United States military psychological operations personnel. His demonstration that cultural knowledge could achieve tactical success influenced thinking about language training and cultural preparation for military personnel going forward. The Marine Corps has incorporated lessons from Gabaldon's experience into various training programs, though specific manuals or policies that directly cite his influence aren't available to the public. His example gets used to illustrate the value of language skills and cultural understanding in military operations across the board. Modern military operations in Iraq and Afghanistan have demonstrated the continued relevance of Gabaldon's approach in contemporary conflicts. Units with embedded interpreters who understand not just language but the underlying culture have consistently reported better outcomes when interacting with civilian populations. The principle Gabaldon demonstrated back in 1944, that understanding enemy culture can be just as valuable as firepower, remains absolutely valid in today's conflicts. Historians evaluate Gabaldon's achievements within the broader context of the Pacific War as a whole. The Battle for Saipan ranked among the war's bloodiest engagements, with casualty rates exceeding 90% for Japanese military forces. Against this backdrop, Gabaldon's ability to convince any Japanese to surrender at all was extraordinary by any measure. Dr. Gordon W. Prange, the noted Pacific War historian, included Gabaldon's story in his studies of individual heroism during World War II. While noting the difficulty in verifying specific details of Gabaldon's claims given the nature of his solo operations, Prang acknowledged that the Marine Corps' official recognition through awarding the Navy Cross validates the essential truth of his achievements. The challenge in assessing Gabaldon's legacy comes down to separating verified facts from later embellishments that might have crept in over the years. The core achievement, capturing approximately 1,500 Japanese soldiers and civilians through persuasion rather than force, stands documented in military records. The specific details of exactly how he accomplished this remain less clear and harder to pin down definitively. The documented statistics of Gabaldon's service tell their own compelling story when you look at the verified captures, which according to his Navy Cross citation number well over 1,000, and according to Marine Corps official records sit at approximately 1,500. His final rank was Private First Class, having been promoted during his service. His primary decoration was the Navy Cross, awarded on November 23, 1960. His secondary decoration was the Silver Star, which later got upgraded to the Navy Cross. He also received the Purple Heart for wounds received in action. These numbers, while genuinely impressive on paper, only hint at the human dimension of what Gabaldon actually achieved out there. Each capture represented a life saved, Japanese soldiers and civilians who survived the war because one Marine chose persuasion over violence, conversation over combat. Gabaldon's success demonstrates principles that are now recognized in psychological operations across military branches. His approach incorporated several key elements that made it effective. First off, he operated from a position of apparent vulnerability. By approaching alone, announcing himself, claiming to be unarmed, these actions directly contradicted Japanese propaganda about American brutality and aggression. His small stature, standing just 5 feet 4 inches and weighing 123 pounds, made him far less physically threatening than the demon-like Americans described in all that propaganda. Second, he used familiar language patterns, not the formal Japanese of military communications that would sound foreign and threatening, but the conversational Japanese of daily life that suggested genuine cultural knowledge rather than military phrasebook learning. Third, he demonstrated remarkable patience in his approach. Military records indicate he'd spend hours sitting outside caves, talking continuously, allowing fear to subside gradually rather than demanding immediate action. This patience stood in stark contrast to the image of aggressive, impatient Americans that Japanese propaganda had promoted so heavily. Fourth, he offered dignity and surrender rather than demanding unconditional capitulation with all the shame that implied. He framed surrender as a means to protect families, to survive for Japan's future reconstruction after the war ended. This reframing provided psychological space for surrender without complete loss of honor, which was crucial for Japanese soldiers and civilians. To really understand what Gabaldon achieved, you have to grasp the intensity of Japanese propaganda on Saipan and throughout the Pacific Islands. Military authorities had told civilians in no uncertain terms that Americans would torture all captured men, rape all women, and literally eat children. The propaganda actually depicted Americans as cannibals who would desecrate Japanese bodies and destroy Japanese culture entirely. This wasn't subtle propaganda. It was reinforced by military police who physically forced civilians toward the cliffs, by officers who distributed grenades to families for suicide purposes, and by constant repetition that death was infinitely preferable to capture. Civilian suicides were framed as noble martyrdom for the emperor rather than tragedy. Against this massive wall of propaganda, Gabaldon's ability to convince anyone to surrender seems almost impossible when you think about it. Yet he succeeded repeatedly through patient demonstration that the propaganda was completely false. His very presence as a small young Marine speaking Japanese, approaching alone and unarmed, contradicted everything civilians had been told about Americans from day one. Gabaldon's experience offers lessons that remain relevant in today's world. In conflicts where civilian populations get caught between combatants, cultural understanding can prevent casualties more effectively than any amount of firepower. His methods suggest several key principles worth noting. Language skills absolutely must include cultural knowledge to be truly effective. Individual initiative can achieve results that formal military operations simply cannot match. Patience and respect can overcome even the most intense propaganda campaigns. Treating current enemies as potential future allies can create unexpected opportunities that otherwise wouldn't exist. Small unit or individual operations can sometimes succeed where large-scale operations inevitably fail. These lessons have been applied with varying degrees of success in recent conflicts around the world. In Iraq and Afghanistan, units that invested seriously in cultural training and language skills reported significantly better outcomes in their civilian interactions than units that didn't. However, the systematic application of Gabaldon's approach remains limited by military doctrine that continues to prioritize force protection and conventional operations over patient cultural engagement. The question of verification haunts Gabaldon's story to this day. Lieutenant Robert B. Sheeks's characterization of him as a relentless self-promoter suggests some real skepticism existed about his claims even among those who served alongside him. The nature of his operations, conducted alone at night without witnesses, makes independent verification genuinely difficult, if not impossible in many cases. Yet several factors support the essential truth of his achievements when you examine them closely. First, there's official military recognition through the Navy Cross Citation, which represents formal military acknowledgement of his accomplishments. Second, you have intelligence officer verification, with 3 Marine intelligence officers publicly verifying his capture numbers on national television in 1957. Third, there's contemporary documentation, as Marine Corps records from 1944 document the July 8th capture of 807 prisoners. Fourth, there's logical consistency to consider. His Japanese language skills are thoroughly documented, as is the historical fact that many Japanese did surrender on Saipan, despite all the propaganda telling them not to. The exact details of specific operations may well be unverifiable at this point, but the overall achievement appears solid when examined critically. Gabaldon convinced large numbers of Japanese to surrender through persuasion rather than force, a feat that's documented in military records and recognized with one of the nation's highest military honors. His story represents more than just military achievement when you really think about it. It demonstrates the power of cultural bridge building even in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. His ability to speak Japanese wasn't merely linguistic, it was fundamentally cultural in nature. He understood concepts of honor and family and shame that shaped Japanese thinking at a deep level. He could speak not just to Japanese soldiers, but as someone who genuinely understood their worldview and values. This cultural bridge-building capability came directly from his unique background growing up as a Mexican-American raised partially in a Japanese-American household. This multicultural experience, far from being any kind of liability in military terms, became his greatest military asset in the field. He could navigate between cultures in ways that traditionally trained military interpreters simply could not match, having lived the culture rather than just studied it. His story challenges conventional military thinking that prioritizes firepower and technology above all else. In the battle for Saipan, one teenager with language skills saved more lives than entire battalions equipped with superior weapons and technology. His success strongly suggests that military forces that actually reflect America's diversity possess advantages that go way beyond traditional metrics of military power. Guy Gabaldon's legacy extends well beyond his wartime achievements when you consider the broader picture. He demonstrated that individual initiative, cultural understanding, and moral courage could achieve results that seemed absolutely impossible beforehand. His story offers several enduring lessons worth remembering. First, diversity genuinely strengthens military capability in concrete ways. Gabaldon's Mexican-American background, combined with his Japanese cultural knowledge, created unique operational possibilities that wouldn't otherwise have existed. Modern military forces that embrace diversity gain similar advantages across the board. Second, unconventional approaches can achieve conventional objectives sometimes better than standard methods. Gabaldon violated military protocol by operating alone against orders, yet achieved results that conventional operations simply couldn't match through normal channels. Innovation and flexibility remain crucial in military operations today, just as they were then. Third, treating enemies as humans rather than mere targets can create unexpected opportunities that aggressive tactics would completely foreclose. Gabaldon's respectful approach to Japanese soldiers and civilians opened up possibilities that more aggressive tactics would have destroyed instantly. Fourth, individual courage can have strategic impact way beyond what you'd expect from one person. One Marine's actions saved approximately 1,500 lives and demonstrated to everyone watching that American forces could show mercy even in the most brutal combat situations. This had implications that extended far beyond Saipan itself, potentially influencing Japanese views of Americans throughout the Pacific theater. While celebrating Gabaldon's achievements, historical accuracy requires acknowledging certain limitations and controversies that exist around his story. Some specific claims he made remain unverified by any independent sources that historians can find. His own accounts, written decades after the events took place, may well contain embellishments that crept in over time. The lack of witnesses to many of his operations makes verification extremely difficult in practical terms. His self-promotion activities after the war ended may have affected how others perceived his credibility. The exact influence his methods had on military doctrine remains essentially undocumented in official records. These limitations don't negate his genuine achievements, but they remind us that historical heroes are always complex figures whose stories often grow larger in the telling over years and decades. The verified core of Gabaldon's story, the Navy Cross citation, the Marine Corps records, the intelligence officer confirmations on national television, remains genuinely remarkable even without any embellishment whatsoever. The statistics from the Battle of Saipan provide crucial context for understanding what he accomplished. Of approximately 30,000 Japanese military personnel on the island, fewer than 1,000 survived the battle. Of approximately 22,000 Japanese civilians caught on the island, thousands died by suicide during the fighting. American forces suffered over 3,000 killed and 10,000 wounded in taking the island. Every single person Gabaldon convinced to surrender was subtracted from these absolutely terrible statistics. His 1,500 captures represent 1,500 people who lived instead of died, who returned to families instead of becoming casualties, who participated in post-war reconstruction instead of ending up among the war dead. This human dimension transcends simple military metrics and numbers on a page. Behind each capture was a real human being, someone's son or husband or father or brother. Behind each civilian saved was a family preserved intact, children who grew up with parents instead of becoming orphans, communities that retained members instead of losing them forever. The ripple effects of those lives saved extend through multiple generations down to today. After the war ended, Gabaldon's life took various interesting turns. He worked as a civilian interpreter during the occupation of Japan in the immediate post-war period. He later moved to Saipan itself, where he lived for 20 years running a fishing business and maintaining connections with the island where he'd made his historical mark. His decision to actually live on Saipan for 2 decades suggests a deep connection to the place and quite possibly to the people he'd saved during the battle. Though specific reunions with saved individuals aren't documented in available records, his long residence on the island definitely indicates ongoing engagement with its history and people. In his later years, Gabaldon became a strong advocate for Hispanic recognition in military history more broadly. He spoke regularly at schools, veterans events, and community gatherings, sharing his experiences and insights with anyone who'd listen. His advocacy work contributed to broader recognition of Hispanic contributions to American military success across multiple conflicts. Gabaldon's burial at Arlington National Cemetery represents official recognition of his service at the highest level. Arlington maintains strict eligibility requirements, which means his interment there confirms military acknowledgement of his extraordinary contributions beyond any doubt. His grave has become something of a pilgrimage site for those interested in Hispanic military history and unconventional warfare methods. Various organizations have honored Gabaldon's memory in different ways over the years. Hispanic veterans groups regularly cite him as a prime example of Latino military excellence in American history. Marine Corps units studying psychological operations reference his techniques as teaching examples. Language training programs use his story to illustrate the concrete tactical value of cultural knowledge in military contexts. However, unlike some war heroes who get major monuments and ships named after them, Gabaldon has no major memorial, no ship bearing his name, no permanent museum exhibition dedicated to his achievements. His story remains relatively unknown outside military history circles and among those specifically interested in Hispanic contributions to American military efforts. This relative obscurity may reflect some discomfort with unconventional warfare methods that fall outside standard doctrine, or perhaps lingering skepticism about his achievements among some historians. In our current era of asymmetric warfare, cultural conflict, and concerns about civilian casualties, Gabaldon's approach offers highly relevant lessons for contemporary military forces. Modern conflicts in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and elsewhere demonstrate clearly that military success requires much more than just firepower and technology. Understanding enemy culture, building genuine trust with civilian populations, and providing real alternatives to violence remain absolutely crucial to achieving objectives. Counterinsurgency doctrine now emphasizes many of the same principles Gabaldon demonstrated intuitively back in 1944. The critical importance of language skills, deep cultural knowledge, patient engagement with populations, and treating potential enemies as potential allies instead. His success on Saipan really prefigured modern thinking about population-centric warfare decades before these concepts became formalized. Yet military institutions still struggle mightily to implement these lessons in any systematic way. Language training remains frustratingly limited across the services, cultural knowledge stays superficial in most cases, and conventional kinetic operations continue to be prioritized over patient engagement with populations. Gabaldon's example suggests real possibilities that military organizations have yet to fully realize or implement effectively. Central to Gabaldon's success was his nuanced understanding of Japanese concepts of honor, which differed significantly from American notions. He didn't simply demand dishonorable surrender in blunt terms, but offered honorable alternatives that Japanese soldiers and civilians could accept, protecting families, preserving life for future service to Japan, choosing life without completely abandoning dignity or losing face. This subtle understanding of how honor worked in Japanese culture allowed Japanese soldiers and civilians to surrender without experiencing complete psychological destruction in the process. This particular aspect of his approach deserves special attention from anyone studying his methods. Military forces throughout history have often badly misunderstood enemy concepts of honor, leading to unnecessary casualties on both sides that could have been avoided with better cultural knowledge. Gabaldon's ability to work within Japanese honor frameworks rather than clumsily against them created real possibilities for peaceful resolution that conventional military thinking would have completely missed or dismissed. His own sense of honor is also noteworthy when you think about it. Operating alone without any witnesses around, he could have massively exaggerated his achievements without anyone being able to detect the fabrication. The fact that Marine Corps intelligence officers verified his claims on the record suggests essential honesty in his accounts, even if specific details may have grown somewhat larger in later retellings over the years. Guy Louis Gabaldon died in 2006, having saved approximately 1,500 enemy lives through individual initiative, cultural knowledge, and genuine physical courage under fire. His Navy Cross citation stands as official military recognition of extraordinary heroism in combat conditions. His story demonstrates powerfully that warfare's greatest heroes aren't always those who kill the most enemies on the battlefield, but sometimes those who save the most lives through other means. The boy from Boyle Heights who learned Japanese from his adoptive family became a Marine who used that knowledge to prevent massacre on a Pacific island thousands of miles from home. His transformation from street kid to war hero to advocate for proper recognition represents a distinctly American story in many ways. A multicultural background creating unique capabilities that wouldn't otherwise exist. Individual initiative achieving extraordinary results beyond what anyone expected, and a lifetime commitment to sharing lessons learned with future generations. Whatever controversies swirl around specific details that can't be verified, the core truth remains absolutely solid. Guy Gabaldon saved more enemy lives through persuasion and cultural understanding than perhaps any other individual soldier in American military history across all our conflicts. On blood-soaked Saipan, where death seemed like the only possible option for Japanese soldiers and civilians trapped between American forces and their own propaganda, One small Marine offered life as an alternative and was actually believed by hundreds of people. When you strip away all the myth-making and controversy that's accumulated over the decades, Guy Gabaldon's verified achievements remain genuinely extraordinary by any standard. A Mexican-American teenager who learned Japanese from his adoptive family used those exact skills to save approximately 1,500 enemy lives on Saipan during some of the war's most brutal fighting. Military records definitively confirm his mass capture of 807 prisoners on July 8, 1944. His Navy Cross citation validates his overall achievements across the entire campaign. These documented facts alone make Gabaldon one of World War II's most unique heroes, operating in ways nobody else did. Not a conventional warrior who racked up high enemy body counts, but a cultural bridge builder who saved enemies from certain death. Not some powerful fighter who dominated through sheer physical strength, but a small young man who succeeded through genuine understanding and patience. Not a traditional military interpreter who barked demands for surrender through a bullhorn, but a culturally fluent negotiator who offered dignity in defeat and made it believable. His story serves as a powerful reminder that America's real strength comes not just from overwhelming military power, but from diversity that creates unexpected capabilities nobody could plan for. A Mexican-American boy raised partly in a Japanese-American household who could speak the enemy's language in familiar terms offered an alternative to death when death seemed inevitable. That approximately 1,500 people accepted his offer despite everything they'd been told about American brutality testifies to the genuine power of cultural understanding over violence and propaganda. Guy Gabaldon proved conclusively that in warfare's darkest moments, individual choice and cultural knowledge can save lives that seem inevitably lost to the machinery of war. His legacy isn't measured just in the raw number of captures he brought in, but in the demonstration that understanding enemies as fellow humans creates possibilities that seeing them only as targets completely forecloses from the start. In the brutal arithmetic of war, where success usually gets measured in enemy killed, he chose the addition of lives saved over the subtraction of lives taken. This verified legacy, thoroughly documented in military records, confirmed by intelligence officers on national television, recognized with high military decoration, stands as genuine testament to unconventional heroism of the highest order. The exact details of specific operations conducted alone in darkness may remain forever unverifiable by their very nature, but the essential truth persists through all the fog of history. On Saipan in 1944, Guy Gabaldon saved more enemy lives through individual initiative than perhaps any other American soldier in our entire history across all wars and conflicts. That achievement, stripped completely of embellishment and mythology, remains thoroughly worthy of the honor, serious study, and permanent remembrance it has received from those who know the story. The boy from Boyle Heights became a genuine Marine hero, not through conventional military prowess measured in confirmed kills, but through cultural bridge building that saved lives on both sides of war's terrible divide. In that verified truth lies a legacy absolutely worth preserving for future generations and lessons genuinely worth learning for anyone who'll listen. The mathematics of his achievement remain staggering when you really stop to think about them. 1,500 human beings who walked away from Saipan alive instead of dying in caves or jumping from cliffs, 1,500 families that remained intact instead of being destroyed, 1,500 futures that unfolded instead of ending in that summer of 1944 on a small Pacific island most Americans had never heard of before the battle started.